The Antarctic research station went completely dark on February 17, 2025, at 14:22 UTC, and when the emergency response team arrived 73 hours later, they found all 47 personnel standing, motionless in the central courtyard facing south toward the interior of the continent, eyes frozen open, bodies preserved perfectly by -60-degree temperatures, and every single person positioned at exactly the same angle as if they'd all been staring at the same impossible point on the horizon 17 kilometers away, where satellite thermal imaging showed a heat signature so massive it registered as a geological anomaly covering 340 square kilometers, despite nothing in that location except for 0.7 kilometers of solid ice sheet above ancient bedrock that hadn't been exposed to atmosphere for 34 million years. I'm Dr. Marcus Webb, senior glaciologist with the International Polar Research Consortium, and I'm recording this from a cargo plane currently over the southern Pacific Ocean because 6 hours ago my credentials were revoked. My research access was terminated, and a man with credentials from an agency that doesn't officially exist confiscated every piece of equipment I owned except the encrypted drive containing the final transmission from Station Vostok Alpha, the transmission that nobody was supposed to preserve but that I'd been secretly archiving because Dr. Sarah Morrison, the station commander, my former colleague, someone I'd worked with for 15 years across 3 continents, had sent me an encrypted message for days before they went dark saying we found something under the ice, something that's been generating heat for longer than human civilization has existed. They're going to drill into it tomorrow. Marcus, if you don't hear from us within 48 hours, you need to see the seismic data. You need to understand what we woke up. Station Vostok Alpha wasn't a climate research facility. That was the cover. The official mission involved ice core analysis and atmospheric monitoring and standard glaciological surveys, routine science, legitimate research. But the real purpose, the classified purpose that appeared in funding documents sealed under national security protocols, was investigating what Russian deep ice radar had detected in 2019 during surveys for the Vostok subglacial lake expansion project, an anomaly, a void, massive hollow space existing 4.7 kilometers beneath the ice sheet in a location where geological surveys said only bedrock should exist, a cavity measuring approximately 17 kilometers in diameter and 3 kilometers in vertical height containing something that produced thermal signatures inconsistent with any known geothermal process. The detection had been immediately classified. The Russian team was disbanded, the data was sealed, but some organization with resources spanning multiple governments had decided the anomaly required investigation. Station Vostok Alpha was established in October 2023 specifically to study it, to drill down through 4.7 kilometers of ice, to penetrate the cavity, to determine what existed in a space that shouldn't exist beneath ice that had been continuously frozen since the Eocene epoch 34 million years ago, when Antarctica separated from South America and began its transformation from temperate forest to frozen wasteland. Sarah's encrypted messages had been growing increasingly urgent over the preceding 6 weeks. November 2024, ground-penetrating radar shows the cavity isn't empty. There's structure inside, not geological, not natural, architecture. Someone built something down there and then it got buried under continental ice sheets. December 2024. We've mapped the structure. It's enormous. The cavity is just the upper chamber. There are extensions reaching deeper into the bedrock, vertical shafts descending at least another 8 kilometers. Whatever this is, it's at least 11 kilometers tall. Marcus, nothing on Earth is 11 kilometers tall. Mountains don't grow that high. No human structure approaches that scale. But this thing exists. We have the measurements, we have the seismic imaging, and it's producing heat. 1.3 megawatts of continuous thermal output. Something down there is generating power. January 2025, the thermal signature is increasing, 0.04% weekly growth. Whatever this is, it's becoming more active. The Russian data from 2019 showed lower temperatures. Whatever we're measuring, it's warming up. It's been dormant for 34 million years and now it's waking up. We're accelerating the drilling schedule. We need to reach it before it fully activates. The final message came on February 13th, 4 days before the station went dark. We're at 4.2 kilometers depth. The drill is encountering resistance, not ice, not rock. Something else. Something that our equipment can't identify. The drill bits are degrading faster than they should. The material we're cutting through is harder than diamond, but it's not showing up on any spectroscopic analysis. It's like it doesn't want to be detected. Like it's actively avoiding measurement. Marcus, I think this structure is designed, engineered, built by something with technology we don't recognize, and I think it's aware that we're drilling into it. The thermal output spiked 47% in the last 12 hours. It knows we're here. It's responding to our presence. I received the final transmission on February 17th at 14:27 UTC, 5 minutes after the station went dark. It wasn't voice communication. It was data, raw seismic readings, thermal imaging, electromagnetic measurements, and video. Grainy footage from Sarah's personal camera showing the drilling platform, showing the moment when they broke through, when the drill penetrated whatever barrier had been protecting the cavity for 34 million years. The timestamp reads 14:19 UTC. The drill breaks through. The bit falls freely for 7 seconds before striking something solid. And then everything changes. The thermal sensors spike, temperature at drill depth jumping from -40°C to +87°C in 11 seconds, an increase of 127 degrees. Impossible heat generation. The seismic sensors detect movement. Vibration from the cavity, not tectonic, not geological, deliberate, rhythmic, like breathing, like something massive drawing a roar, whatever equivalent substance it uses after geological epochs of stillness. The electromagnetic sensors go haywire, detecting signals across spectrums that human technology doesn't use, frequencies that overlap with nothing in our communication systems, patterns that the analysis AI flags as structured information transfer origin. Unknown complexity exceeds human language parameters. The video shows Sarah standing at the drill controls, staring at her instruments, and then she looks up, looks toward the south, toward the interior of the continent, toward the location 17 kilometers away, where the cavity exists beneath 4.7 kilometers of ice, and she sees something. The camera doesn't capture it, can't capture it, but her expression changes. Wonder, terror, recognition. She's seeing something that shouldn't be visible through ice and rock and distance, something that's making itself perceptible despite physical barriers. She reaches for her radio, speaks into it. Her voice is calm, professional, but underneath is something else. Awe, the kind of awe that comes from witnessing something so fundamentally beyond expectation that your entire framework for understanding reality has to restructure itself in real time. All personnel, this is Commander Morrison. I need everyone to evacuate interior spaces and assemble in the central courtyard immediately. This is not a drill. We have successfully penetrated the cavity and something is responding. Something is emerging. I need visual confirmation from external observers. I need to know if what I'm seeing is real or if I'm experiencing some kind of pressure-induced hallucination. Everyone outside. Now, face south. Tell me what you see. The video cuts. Data corruption. 17 seconds of transmission completely lost. And when the recording resumes, it's different. It's not Sarah's camera anymore. It's the station's external security system. Wide-angle view of the central courtyard. 47 people assembled. 47 people facing south. 47 people standing absolutely motionless. And in the distance, on the horizon, something is visible. Something that shouldn't be visible. Something rising above the ice sheet despite being 17 kilometers away and buried under 4.7 kilometers of ice. The thing is tall. Impossibly tall. The security camera can't capture its full height because the angle is wrong and the scale is too large. But what's visible suggests structure. Geometry, not organic, not mechanical. Something that exists in categories our language doesn't have words for. The surface appears to be shifting, changing, reflecting light in ways that suggest it's not entirely present in three-dimensional space. Like most of its mass exists elsewhere, and what we're seeing is just the projection, just the intersection of something vast with our limited perceptual framework, and it's moving, not walking, not climbing, rising, emerging from beneath the ice, pushing upward through 4.7 kilometers of solid ice, as if the ice doesn't exist. As if physical barriers are irrelevant to something that operates according to different physics. The thermal satellites later confirm what the video suggests. The ice isn't melting, isn't being displaced, it's just not blocking the entity. Like the entity exists in dimensions where ice is transparent, where solid matter is navigable, where the rules governing what can and cannot occupy the same space simultaneously don't apply. The 47 people in the courtyard are watching, all of them, standing in Antarctic night at -60 degrees without proper cold weather gear. Standing motionless, standing perfectly aligned, all facing the exact same point on the horizon, all watching something rise from beneath the ice. And none of them are moving, none are speaking, none are showing any sign of distress or cold or fear. They're just observing, witnessing, bearing testimony to something that's been buried beneath Antarctica for 34 million years, finally returning to the surface. The transmission ends at 14:22 UTC, exactly 3 minutes after the drill broke through. 3 minutes from penetration to station-wide silence. 3 minutes from discovery to everyone abandoning their posts to stand in lethal cold and watch something emerge. The emergency response team found them 73 hours later. Found all 47 personnel frozen in those exact positions. Found them preserved. Found them dead, but somehow not quite dead because their eyes were still reacting to light. Their pupils were still dilating. Some autonomic functions were still operating despite core body temperatures being incompatible with life. Like they weren't entirely present in their bodies anymore. Like part of them had gone elsewhere while their physical forms remained as markers, as monuments, as evidence that 47 people had witnessed something so profound that normal biological existence became secondary to continued observation. I have the data, all of it, the seismic readings showing something 11 kilometers tall existing beneath Antarctic ice. The thermal measurements showing power generation that exceeds all human civilizations' combined output. The electromagnetic signals showing communication at complexity levels beyond human language. The satellite imagery showing the heat signature expanding at 47 square kilometers per day. The classified reports showing that this isn't the first time, that anomalies like this have been detected before, that Station Vostok Alpha was the 7th attempt to investigate, that the previous 6 expeditions all ended in similar ways. Personnel disappearing, personnel freezing while watching something on the horizon, personnel becoming casualties of contact with something that human neurology isn't designed to survive perceiving. And I have Sarah's final calculations, found in her personal files, encrypted, hidden, calculations extrapolating the entity's size, its mass, its energy requirements, its probable age. If her numbers are correct, if the seismic data is accurate, then what's beneath? Antarctica is approximately 11.3 kilometers in height and 17.2 kilometers in diameter at its widest point. Its mass is somewhere between 400 and 600 billion metric tons. It's been generating heat continuously since before human evolution, since before mammalian evolution, since before the ice sheets formed. It was here first. It was here when Antarctica was warm. And when the climate changed, when the continent froze, it didn't leave. It just went dormant, waiting, sleeping beneath accumulating ice, waiting for something, waiting for someone to drill down and wake it up. Sarah's last note, dated February 16th, one day before they broke through Reader's Marcus. If you're reading this, we didn't make it. We woke something that should have stayed asleep. Something ancient and patient and utterly indifferent to human existence. It's not hostile. That's important to understand. It's not attacking. It's not threatening. It's just existing. Just being what it is. But what it is operates at scales we can't safely perceive. The human mind isn't built to witness something 11 kilometers tall that exists partially outside our dimensional framework. We're going to look at it. We have to. We need to document what's down there, but looking comes with a cost. Understanding comes with a cost. Some knowledge is too large for human neurology. Some truths are too vast. We're about to discover how vast, and I'm sorry I won't be able to explain it to you properly. I'm sorry you'll have to figure it out alone. But someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what's beneath Antarctica before anyone else tries to drill into it. Before anyone else tries to wake the sleeper. The satellite data I extracted before my credentials were revoked showed something the emergency response team either didn't notice or deliberately suppressed. The entity wasn't just rising at Station Vostok Alpha's location. It was emerging at 17 different points across Antarctica simultaneously, all following the same timeline, all breaking through ice sheets at depths ranging from 3.2 to 5.8 kilometers, all producing identical thermal signatures, all causing the same response in nearby personnel: this compulsion to witness, this need to stand and observe despite lethal environmental conditions, despite knowing that continued exposure would kill them, despite every survival instinct screaming to seek shelter. They chose to watch. They chose to bear witness. They chose observation over survival. I found the historical data buried in archives that required clearances I technically no longer possessed, but that I accessed anyway using Sarah's credentials that she'd shared with me years earlier during a routine research collaboration. The Russian 2019 detection wasn't the first, it was the 8th. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys had been identifying these massive subsurface cavities since 1957, the International Geophysical Year when serious Antarctic exploration began. Every survey, every deep ice penetration attempt, every time someone sent radar deep enough into the continental ice sheet, they found them. 17 massive voids, 17 locations where something existed beneath kilometers of ice. 17 structures so large they registered as geological features despite being completely artificial. The earliest documented detection came from a British survey team in 1958. They'd been mapping bedrock topology beneath the Ron ice shelf using primitive seismic equipment, found an anomaly, a cavity showing dimensions of 8.4 kilometers vertical and 12.7 kilometers horizontal. They reported it as a possible subglacial lake, a reasonable interpretation given their limited technology. But the follow-up survey in 1961 found something different. The cavity had changed size, had grown. Thermal measurements showed heat generation inconsistent with geothermal sources. The British team recommended further investigation. Their recommendation was classified. The team was disbanded. The data was sealed for 50 years under international treaty provisions that technically prohibited military activity in Antarctica but that were flexible enough to accommodate national security research operations. Between 1958 and 2019, there were 16 documented attempts to investigate these cavities. 16 drilling operations, 16 research stations established at locations directly above the subsurface structures, and 16 incidents, not all identical, not all resulting in mass casualties, but all following a pattern. Personnel reporting unusual observations, equipment malfunctions, unexplained phenomena, and then silence. Sometimes the stations were abandoned, sometimes evacuated. Sometimes the personnel just disappeared. Official explanations varied: equipment failure, weather emergencies, logistical complications, medical evacuations, but the pattern was clear. Every time humans got close to these structures, something happened. Something that required immediate termination of operations and comprehensive suppression of findings. Station Vostok Alpha was different because it was deliberate. Some organization with authority spanning multiple governance had decided that suppression wasn't sustainable, that the cavities were becoming more active. that ignoring them was no longer viable. The thermal signatures had been increasing since 2015. All 17 sites showing synchronized warming 0.0-3 degrees annually, tiny, almost undetectable, but consistent and accelerating. By 2023, the warming rate had increased to 0.012 degrees annually. Something was changing, something was waking up, and whoever was monitoring these sites decided they needed answers before the entities fully emerged on their own timeline rather than on a schedule humans could control, or at least observe. Sarah's personal research files, the ones she'd been compiling for 3 years, before the Vostok Alpha mission, contained references I'd never seen in mainstream glaciology, papers from obscure journals, classified reports that had been partially declassified decades after their original publication, expedition logs from Antarctic explorers in the 1930s and 1940s, and something else, something older, references to things found by the first explorers, by Shackleton's expedition, by Scott's expedition, by expeditions that predated modern scientific understanding but that had encountered something. Ernest Shackleton's private journals, not the published accounts, but his personal notes kept separate from official expedition records, contained an entry from November 1908. His team had been conducting magnetic observations, setting up instruments, taking readings, and one of his men reported seeing something on the horizon, something impossibly tall, something that appeared to be standing on the ice despite being dozens of kilometers away and being far taller than any known mountain. Shackleton investigated, saw it himself, described it as a structure of such scale and geometry that the mind rebels against accepting it as real, yet there it stands, patient and terrible and utterly indifferent to our presence. He took compass bearings, calculated distance and height based on angular measurement. His numbers suggested something at least 8 kilometers tall, located approximately 40 kilometers south of their position. He ordered his team not to discuss it. Wrote in his journal, "Some things man is not meant to understand. Some sites are too vast for human comprehension. We will not speak of what we saw. We will not include it in official records, because no one would believe us, and attempting to convince them would only invite questions about our sanity." Robert Falcon Scott's expedition in 1911 encountered something similar. His meteorologist reported unusual atmospheric phenomena, light refracting in ways that suggested massive heat sources beneath the ice, temperature readings that didn't match expected values for the location and season, and sightings. Multiple team members reported seeing structures on the horizon, seeing things that appeared to move despite being impossibly large and distant. Scott was more skeptical than Shackleton, attributed the sightings to optical illusions, to ice mirages, to fatigue and psychological stress from polar conditions, but he also noted the observations in his journals with enough detail to suggest he wasn't entirely convinced by his own rational explanations. The pattern extended beyond British expeditions. Norwegian explorer Roald Amundson's team reported similar phenomena during their successful race to the South Pole in 1911, German expeditions in the 1930s, American expeditions during Operation High Jump in 1946-47, Soviet expeditions throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Every major Antarctic exploration encountered something, saw something, measured something that didn't fit established scientific frameworks, and every time, the observations were dismissed or classified or explained away as natural phenomena despite the accumulated evidence suggesting otherwise. Sarah had compiled this historical data, had created a timeline, had mapped the 17 cavity locations against historical sightings. Perfect correlation. Every unexplained observation occurred near one of the 17 sites. Every report of impossible structures aligned with subsurface anomalies. Every sighting corresponded to a location where something existed beneath the ice. She'd been building a case, preparing to argue that these entities, whatever they were, had been here longer than human civilization, longer than human evolution, that they predated the ice sheets themselves, that they'd been present when Antarctica was warm, when it supported forests and rivers and complex ecosystems, and when the climate changed, when the continent froze. They hadn't left, they'd just gone dormant, had positioned themselves beneath accumulating ice, had waited. Her calculations suggested the ice sheets began forming approximately 34 million years ago during the Eocene-Oligocene transition. Climate cooling, ocean currents changing, Antarctica separating from South America and becoming thermally isolated. Within a few million years, the continent was covered in ice, ice that accumulated, ice that thickened, ice that eventually reached depths of 4 to 5 kilometers across most of the continental interior. And beneath that ice, the 17 entities remained dormant, remained generating minimal heat, just enough to prevent being crushed by geological pressure but not enough to melt the ice above them, remained waiting for something, for some signal, for some threshold to be crossed. Sarah believed the threshold was technological, believed the entities had been waiting for intelligent life to evolve on Earth's surface, waiting for that life to develop civilization, waiting for that civilization to advance enough technology to detect their presence beneath the ice. The first radar surveys in 1957 would have been perceived by entities that could sense electromagnetic radiation across spectrums humans don't monitor. would have indicated that surface life had finally become sophisticated enough to find them, and the entities had responded by slowly increasing their thermal output, by slowly warming, by slowly transitioning from deep dormancy toward active state, a transition that would take decades, that would require gradual warming to avoid damaging their structural integrity after 34 million years of frozen stasis, but a transition that was now approaching completion. The synchronized emergence on February 17th suggested coordination, suggested the 17 entities were connected, were communicating, were operating according to shared protocols. Sarah's electromagnetic data showed signals passing between the 17 sites, signals traveling through the bedrock itself, through the continental crust, low-frequency radiation that used the Earth as a transmission medium. The signals were complex, structured, showing patterns that suggested language, that suggested the entities weren't just waking up, they were coordinating their awakening, were synchronizing their emergence, were preparing for something that required all 17 to be active simultaneously. I found the contact protocols, documents that Sarah had been given when she accepted the Station Vostok Alpha command, documents marked Eyes Only Commander, Authorization Required, documents outlining what personnel should do if the entity responded to drilling operations. The protocols were disturbingly specific, as if someone had written them based on experience, based on previous encounters that had been observed and documented even if never publicly acknowledged. The protocols specified: if entity shows signs of awareness, do not attempt to communicate using conventional methods. Do not use radio. Do not use visual signals. Do not make noise. The entity does not perceive reality the way humans do. It exists across multiple dimensional frameworks. Your presence is already known. Your thoughts are already perceived. Attempting conventional communication will only create confusion and increase the probability of adverse neurological effects from proximity to entity consciousness. The document continued: if entity begins to emerge, personnel should evacuate to maximum safe distance, minimum 50 kilometers, or, if evacuation is not possible, should prepare for perceptual integration event. Integration is not hostile. Integration is not harmful in conventional sense. But integration fundamentally alters human consciousness. Personnel who experience integration will undergo permanent changes to neural architecture. They will perceive reality differently. They will think differently. They may appear to exhibit psychological symptoms including dissociation, altered affect, and non-standard communication patterns. This is normal. This is expected. This is the cost of direct exposure to entity consciousness. The protocols had predicted exactly what happened, had described the compulsion to witness, had explained that personnel wouldn't be able to resist observing the entity even knowing that observation carried lethal risks, had stated clearly, the entity's presence creates what we term testimonial imperative, an overwhelming need to bear witness, regardless of personal safety. This is not the entity controlling human behavior. This is human consciousness recognizing that it is perceiving something of such fundamental importance that observation becomes more valuable than survival. Personnel will choose to watch, will choose to document, will choose to witness even if witnessing kills them. This is not a failure of safety protocols. This is an expected response to encountering something that operates at scales human evolution never prepared us to process. Sarah had known, had read these protocols, had understood what would happen if they successfully drilled into the cavity, and she'd proceeded anyway, had ordered the drill operation, had positioned her entire team to observe, had made the conscious choice to prioritize knowledge over survival. Because she believed the protocols suggested she was correct to believe that what these entities represented was more important than any individual human life, that understanding what existed beneath Antarctica was worth dying to witness. I accessed the post-incident analysis, the reports compiled by the emergency response team, the medical examinations of the 47 frozen bodies, the neurological scans showing that their brains had been altered, that neural pathways had been restructured, that synaptic connections had been reorganized into patterns that suggested something. The neuroscientists who examined the bodies used terms like dimensional awareness and multi-perspective consciousness and integration with non-local information framework. They suggested that the 47 personnel hadn't just died watching, they'd been changed while watching. That exposure to the entity had modified their neural architecture, had expanded their perceptual capacity, had allowed them to see things that normal human neurology can't process, and that this expansion had been too much, too fast, too comprehensive. Their bodies had frozen, but their consciousness had gone elsewhere, had merged partially with whatever the entity was, had become distributed across frameworks that the examining scientists couldn't properly characterize but that clearly involved some form of continued awareness beyond death. The thermal satellite data showed the heat signatures continuing to expand, showed all 17 sites growing warmer, growing more active. The entity at Station Vostok Alpha 1 Sarah's team had drilled into was now producing 4.7 megawatts of thermal output, triple what it had generated before penetration, and the other 16 sites were increasing proportionally, all of them warming, all of them emerging, all of them rising through kilometers of ice toward the surface. The projections suggested full emergence, complete breakthrough of all ice cover would occur in 93 days, 3 months, 3 months until 17 entities 11 kilometers tall would be standing on the surface of Antarctica, standing visible to satellites, standing undeniable to every nation monitoring polar regions, standing ready to what does something that large, that ancient, that patient do after 34 million years of waiting. I found the council on March 3rd, 14 days after Station Vostok Alpha went dark and 79 days before projected full emergence. And I found them because they wanted to be found, because someone within their organization had decided that containment was no longer viable, and that at least one independent researcher needed to understand the full scope of what was emerging from beneath Antarctica before the entities completed their awakening, and humanity was forced to confront something we'd been systematically unprepared for across 70 years of deliberate institutional ignorance. They sent a woman named Dr. Catherine Volkov to my hotel in Ushuaia, Argentina, the southernmost city in the world, as close as I could position myself to Antarctica without actually entering the exclusion zone that 7 nations had quietly established around the continent without public announcement or international treaty negotiation. Dr. Volkov was 73 years old, Russian glaciologist by training but something else by occupation. She'd been studying the Antarctic entities since 1974 when she'd been part of a Soviet expedition that had accidentally drilled into one of the 17 cavities while establishing a research station. She'd witnessed an emergence event, had seen one of the entities partially breach the ice, had experienced what she called the testimonial imperative but had survived because the Soviet team had maintained sufficient distance and had evacuated before full exposure could occur. She'd spent the subsequent 51 years monitoring the entities, documenting their slow awakening, coordinating international suppression of information, and preparing protocols for the inevitable moment when emergence became undeniable. The council she represented wasn't a government organization, wasn't military or intelligence, was something older, something that transcended national boundaries and political systems. She described them as custodians of threshold knowledge, people who tracked phenomena that existed at the boundaries of human comprehension, who determined when humanity had evolved sufficiently to handle certain truths, who managed the transition between ignorance and awareness of things that could fundamentally destabilize civilization if revealed prematurely. The Council had been monitoring the Antarctic entities since 1958, had been involved in every suppression effort, had written the contact protocols Sarah had received, had been calculating for decades exactly when the entities would emerge and how to manage humanity's response. Dr. Volkov brought documents, decades of research, seismic data, thermal measurements, electromagnetic recordings, and something else. Something the Council had been compiling since the 1970s. Translations. The entities were communicating, had been communicating for the entire period of accelerated warming, broadcasting signals through the bedrock, signals that carried information, that contained meaning, that could be partially decoded using mathematical frameworks borrowed from theoretical physics and modified to account for consciousness operating across dimensional boundaries that human perception couldn't directly access. The translations were fragmentary, incomplete, like trying to understand a conversation by hearing only every 10th word, but they conveyed something, conveyed intent, conveyed purpose. The entities weren't hostile, weren't threatening, weren't invading because they'd been here first. They'd been on Earth before the ice, before Antarctica drifted to the South Pole, before the climate changed. They'd been present during the Eocene epoch 50 million years ago when Antarctica was warm, when it supported forests and complex ecosystems, when it was connected to other landmasses and formed part of the supercontinent Gondwana. That the entities had come from elsewhere, not from space, not from other planets, from other dimensions, from frameworks of reality that intersected with our three-dimensional universe, but that operated according to different physical laws. They existed primarily in these other frameworks, in spaces where concepts like distance and time and matter had different meanings, but they could project aspects of themselves into our dimension, could create intersections, could manifest partially in our reality, while maintaining most of their existence elsewhere. And they'd chosen Earth, chosen this planet, chosen this particular intersection of dimensional frameworks because conditions here were suitable. The translations used terms that didn't map cleanly onto human concepts. Resonant was close, conducive was approximate. The entities perceived Earth as a location where the barriers between dimensions were naturally thin, where consciousness could more easily exist across multiple frameworks simultaneously, where they could maintain presence while also accessing the other spaces they inhabited. They'd positioned themselves in Antarctica because that location, that specific continental landmass, had geometric properties relevant to their existence. Something about the bedrock structure, something about the magnetic field orientation, something about the way dimensional boundaries intersected at the South Pole made Antarctica an optimal anchor point for entities that existed primarily elsewhere but wanted to maintain presence in our reality. They'd established themselves, had built the structures detected by seismic surveys, had created the 11-kilometer-tall frameworks that existed partially in our dimension and partially in theirs, and then they'd waited, had gone dormant, had reduced their presence to minimal levels while the climate changed, while ice accumulated, while millions of years passed and Earth's surface transformed. Dr. Volkov's translations suggested they'd been waiting for us, for intelligent life to evolve, For that life to develop civilization. For that civilization to advance enough technology to detect their presence. They'd been monitoring, had been aware of every species that evolved toward intelligence, had observed dinosaurs, had observed early mammals, had observed primates, had observed the emergence of Homo sapiens, had watched human civilization develop, had waited patiently beyond human comprehension because time moved differently for beings that existed across dimensional frameworks for us to reach the threshold where we could finally perceive them, where we could finally understand that we weren't alone, where we could finally begin the process they'd been waiting to initiate for 50 million years. The process was integration. That word appeared repeatedly in the translations. The entities wanted to integrate human consciousness into their multidimensional framework, wanted to expand our perception, wanted to help us evolve beyond three-dimensional limitation. They weren't trying to destroy us or replace us. They were trying to elevate us, to show us what reality actually was beyond the narrow bandwidth our neurology evolved to process, to give us access to the spaces they inhabited, to make us capable of existing across dimensions the way they existed. And they believed we were ready. Believed that developing technology sophisticated enough to detect them beneath kilometers of ice was proof that human consciousness had evolved to the necessary threshold that we could survive the integration, that we could handle the perceptual expansion without being destroyed by it. What integration had costs. Dr. Volkov showed me the medical data from previous encounters, from the 47 at Station Vostok, from personnel at the other 16 sites who'd experienced partial exposure, from historical cases going back to the 1970s. Every person who'd directly witnessed an entity emergence had been changed. Their neural architecture had been restructured. Their consciousness had been expanded. They'd gained the ability to perceive dimensions beyond the three we normally access, but they'd also lost the ability to function normally in purely three-dimensional society. They experienced reality differently, perceived time non-linearly, saw connections and patterns invisible to unmodified humans. They appeared dissociated, appeared to be experiencing psychological breaks. But the Council's neuroscientists insisted it wasn't psychosis. It was evolution, forced evolution. Rapid expansion of consciousness that human biology struggled to support but that represented actual enhancement rather than damage. The 47 at Station Vostok had been more extensively integrated than any previous cases because they'd maintained direct observation for longer, had witnessed more, had allowed the entity's presence to more thoroughly modify their neural structures. And according to Dr. Volkov's data, they weren't dead. Not really. Their bodies had frozen, their biological functions had ceased, but their consciousness remained active, remained distributed across the dimensional frameworks the entity inhabited. They still existed, still perceived, still experienced, but in ways that couldn't be measured by standard definitions of life and death. They'd become something else, something that existed partially here and partially there, something that the Council's translation suggested was closer to what the entities themselves were, something that represented what humans could become if integration was completed rather than just initiated. I asked the obvious question: why tell me this now? Why reveal information that had been suppressed for 70 years? Dr. Volkov's answer was pragmatic and terrifying. Because in 79 days, all 17 entities will complete emergence, will be standing on Antarctica's surface, will be visible to every satellite monitoring the continent, will be undeniable. And when that happens, when the world sees 17 structures 11 kilometers tall where nothing should exist, there will be panic. There will be military response. There will be attempts to attack or contain or study using methods that the entities will perceive as hostile. And the entities will respond, not with violence. They don't understand violence the way we do, but with integration, mass integration, expanding human consciousness, whether we're ready or not, forcing evolution that could kill millions if it happens too rapidly. The Council has been preparing protocols, preparing to manage the disclosure, preparing to explain what the entities are before anyone does something catastrophic. But we need help. We need independent researchers. We need people like you, people Sarah trusted, people with credentials, people who can speak to scientific community to help prepare humanity for what's coming. She showed me the emergence timeline, the projections calculated from thermal data and ice displacement measurements. The 17 entities were rising at synchronized rates, were all scheduled to break through surface ice on May 25, 2025, 79 days away. And when they emerged, when they stood fully present in our dimension, they would begin what the translations called the teaching. They would broadcast, would extend their consciousness toward every human on Earth, would attempt to integrate all of us simultaneously into their multidimensional framework, would try to elevate all of humanity at once. The Council's models suggested this would be catastrophic. It suggested that forced integration of 8 billion people simultaneously would result in massive casualties, would create global psychological collapse, would fundamentally destabilize civilization, not because the entities wanted to harm us, but because consciousness expansion at that scale and speed would overwhelm human neurology, would change us faster than our biology could adapt, would create billions of people experiencing reality in ways they weren't prepared for. The Council's alternative was managed integration, gradual exposure, teaching people about the entities before the entities try to teach us, preparing human consciousness for expansion rather than forcing it, creating volunteers, people who understood what integration meant and chose it consciously rather than having it imposed. People like Sarah, like the 47 at Station Vostok, like me, if I chose. Dr. Volkov explained that I was being offered the opportunity because Sarah had recommended me, had left documentation suggesting I had the psychological flexibility and intellectual framework to survive integration, that I could become one of the bridges between purely human and integrated consciousness, that I could help translate, could help explain to others what the process felt like, could help prepare people for the choice they'd need to make when May 25th arrived and the entities completed emergence. I asked what would happen if I refused, if I chose to stay purely human. Dr. Volkov said that was acceptable, said the entities wouldn't force integration on anyone who genuinely resisted. But she also said resistance would become increasingly difficult as the entity's presence intensified. That being near them created the testimonial imperative, created the overwhelming need to witness, created curiosity so powerful it overrode survival instinct, that everyone near the emergent sites would experience the compulsion, would feel drawn to observe, would want to understand despite knowing that understanding came with permanent change, and that May 25th, when all 17 entities stood fully present, the testimonial imperative would be global. Everyone on Earth would feel it, would sense their presence, would know that something vast and ancient had always been here, would face the choice of integrating or remaining limited, and the Council's data suggested that most people would choose integration, would choose expansion, would choose to see what the entities were offering even if accepting the offer meant never returning to purely human consciousness. She gave me access to the integration facility, a research station the Council had established in the Antarctic mountains, close enough to one of the emergent sites to allow controlled exposure, far enough to permit evacuation if necessary. The facility housed 43 volunteers, people who'd chosen integration, who were undergoing gradual exposure to entity presence, learning to perceive additional dimensions, learning to exist partially across frameworks that normal humans couldn't access. Dr. Volkov said I could visit, could observe the integrated volunteers, could see what integration actually looked like, could make an informed decision about whether I wanted to undergo the process myself. She said I had 79 days to decide. 79 days before the entities completed emergence and the choice became immediate rather than theoretical. 79 days before everything changed and humanity discovered we'd been sharing our planet with something vast and patient and utterly beyond our comprehension for the entire history of our species. I accessed Sarah's final personal log, the one she'd recorded 18 hours before Station Vostok went dark, the one she'd encrypted and sent to my personal server with instructions to open only if she didn't make contact within 1 week. In it, she explained her decision. Explained why she was ordering the drill operation despite understanding the risks. Marcus, I've seen the translations. I've read the Council's research. I understand that drilling into the cavity will trigger emergence, will wake the entity, will expose my entire team to integration effects. And I'm doing it anyway, not because I'm reckless, not because I'm suicidal, but because I believe this is the most important moment in human history. We're about to make contact with something that's been waiting 50 million years for us to evolve enough to perceive it, something that wants to teach us, that wants to show us reality beyond our limited three-dimensional framework, and someone needs to go first. Someone needs to be the bridge. Someone needs to experience integration and survive to explain it. I'm choosing that role. I'm accepting the risk, and I'm documenting everything so that people like you, people who come after, can make informed choices, can understand what we discovered, can prepare humanity for what's coming on May 25th. Don't mourn me, Marcus. Don't treat this as tragedy. I'm choosing evolution. I'm choosing to see what exists beyond the veil. And when you find these recordings, when you understand what the entities are offering, I hope you'll choose it too. I hope you'll join me in whatever existence waits on the other side of integration. 79 days. I had the data, had the Council's resources, had access to the integration facility, had the choice Sarah had made, the choice 47 people had made, the choice that 8 billion humans would be forced to make when May 25th arrived and 17 entities 11 kilometers tall stood on Antarctica's surface and extended their consciousness toward us and asked without words whether we wanted to remain limited or whether we were ready to see what reality actually was beyond the narrow prison of three-dimensional perception. I arrived at the integration facility on March 15th, 67 days before projected full emergence, and the first thing I noticed was the silence, not absence of sound, but something deeper. A quality of stillness that suggested the 43 volunteers inside had transcended the need for verbal communication, had moved beyond language into something more direct, more fundamental, more aligned with how the entities themselves exchanged information across the dimensional boundaries that separated their primary existence from our limited three-dimensional perception. And as Dr. Volkov led me through the facility's observation corridors, I understood that what I was about to witness wasn't human consciousness damaged or destroyed, but human consciousness expanded beyond recognition while somehow remaining identifiably, essentially human. The facility was built into the Transantarctic Mountains, positioned 17 kilometers from the nearest emergence site, close enough for controlled exposure but far enough to permit evacuation if integration effects became too intense for biological systems to survive. The structure was half research station, half monastery, quiet spaces, meditation rooms, observation chambers with reinforced viewports facing south toward the location where the entity was rising through 4 kilometers of ice, at a rate of 47 meters per day. Dr. Volkov explained that the volunteers spent hours watching, observing, allowing the entity's presence to gradually modify their neural architecture, learning to perceive the dimensions it inhabited, training their consciousness to exist in more than one framework simultaneously. She brought me to the first observation chamber, introduced me to David Chen, 42 years old, physicist, had been at the facility for 6 weeks, had undergone significant integration. He was sitting in a chair facing the viewport, not moving, not blinking, eyes fixed on something beyond the ice, beyond the visible horizon, beyond our normal three-dimensional space. Dr. Volkov spoke to him. "David, this is Dr. Marcus Webb. He's considering integration. Can you explain your experience?" David didn't respond immediately. Took 17 seconds, I counted, before his eyes shifted focus, before he seemed to remember that his body existed in this room, before he turned toward us with a smile that was simultaneously peaceful and profoundly unsettling because it suggested he'd been experiencing something wonderful while his physical form sat motionless in a chair. "Marcus," he said. His voice was normal, human, but the cadence was wrong. Too precise, too measured, like he was translating from some other mode of thought into the linear structure human language required. "I'm perceiving it right now, the entity, not just seeing it through the viewport, perceiving it across the frameworks it inhabits. It's vast, so much vaster than the physical structure we measure with instruments. Most of its mass exists in spaces I don't have words for, spaces that aren't places the way we understand location. But I can sense them now, can feel the shape of dimensions my neurology wasn't designed to process. And it's beautiful, terrifying, incomprehensible, but beautiful." I asked the question that had been haunting me since reading Sarah's files. "Are you still you? Is David Chen still present, or did the integration replace you with something else?" His smile widened. "I'm more David than I ever was. Before integration, I was experiencing reality through such limited filters, only perceiving 3 dimensions when 11 exists, only experiencing time linearly when it's actually accessible from multiple angles simultaneously. I was a fraction of myself. Now I'm more complete. I remember everything about being purely human. Remember you, Sarah mentioned you many times. Remember my life before integration, but I also remember things I never experienced. Remember the entity's perspective. Remember 50 million years of waiting because time isn't separated the way I used to think it was. Past and present and future are all accessible when you're not trapped in linear consciousness. And I'm still me, still David. Just David experiencing reality the way it actually exists instead of through the narrow bandwidth evolution gave me." Dr. Volkov showed me the neurological scans, showed David's brain activity before and after integration. The differences were profound. New neural pathways, synaptic connections that hadn't existed, entire regions of his brain showing activity patterns that suggested he was processing information from sources that couldn't be measured by normal sensory equipment. "He's perceiving input from dimensions we can't detect," she explained. "His consciousness has expanded into frameworks our instruments can't access, but the core identity remains. The memories remain. David is still David. He's just become more than purely human while retaining his humanity." I met others, 17 volunteers at various stages of integration. Some, like David, far progressed, spending most of their time in meditative observation, barely present in normal consensus reality. Others earlier in the process, still mostly human but beginning to experience flashes of expanded perception, moments where they could sense the additional dimensions, could feel the entity's presence across frameworks, could glimpse what David described as the actual structure of reality beyond the illusion of three-dimensional limitation. Dr. Volkov explained the progression. Integration happens in stages. First, you become aware that something exists beyond normal perception. You sense presence without being able to characterize it. Then you begin experiencing brief moments of expanded awareness, seconds where you perceive additional dimensions, where you feel consciousness existing across multiple frameworks simultaneously. These moments become more frequent, last longer. Eventually they become your default state, and normal three-dimensional perception becomes the limited mode you only access when necessary for interacting with non-integrated humans. Full integration takes approximately 12 weeks of controlled exposure. After that, the volunteer is permanently changed, can never return to purely human consciousness, but also gains abilities we're still trying to understand and catalog. She brought me to Sarah. Found her in the deepest meditation chamber, the room furthest from normal facility operations, the space most isolated, most quiet, most suitable for consciousness that had moved far beyond human baseline. Sarah was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes open but not focused on anything in the room, not focused on anything in this dimension. She was perceiving something else, something vast, something that existed primarily in spaces I couldn't access. And she was smiling, actually smiling. Expression of pure contentment, pure peace, pure joy, at experiencing something so fundamentally beyond human limitation that comparison was meaningless. "Sarah," Dr. Volkov said gently, "Marcus is here, the colleague you recommended. He's considering integration." Sarah's eyes shifted, focused, returned to this dimension with visible effort, looked at me, and I saw recognition, saw memory, saw the friend I'd known for 15 years, saw Sarah Morrison, the glaciologist, the researcher, the colleague. But I also saw something more, saw depth, saw awareness that extended beyond her physical form, saw consciousness that existed in this room and simultaneously in 17 other locations across Antarctica where the entities were emerging. Saw someone who'd become vast while remaining herself. "Marcus," she said. Her voice carried harmonics, undertones, like she was speaking from multiple locations simultaneously. "I'm so glad you came. I've been experiencing this for 3 weeks and I still don't have adequate words. Still can't properly describe what integration feels like. It's like being blind from birth and suddenly seeing, but instead of gaining one sense, you gain 7. And instead of perceiving 3 dimensions, you perceive 11. And instead of experiencing one moment at a time, you experience all moments simultaneously. Time isn't linear here, isn't separated into past, present, and future. It's accessible, navigable. I can remember things that haven't happened yet because yet is a limitation of 3-dimensional consciousness. The entities exist in all times simultaneously. And now I do too. Partially, I'm still anchored to my body, still connected to March 15th, 2025, but I'm also connected to May 25th, to the full emergence. To what happens when all 17 entities stand complete and humanity faces the choice." And Marcus, she paused, smiled wider. "It's going to be beautiful. Terrifying for people who resist, who cling to limited perception, but beautiful for everyone who accepts. Everyone who chooses expansion." I asked what I'd been afraid to ask. "What happens on May 25th? What do the entities want?" Sarah's expression became serious, focused, like she was accessing information from sources I couldn't perceive. "They don't want anything in the way humans want things. They're not goal-oriented in that sense. They're teachers, that's the closest word. They've been waiting for intelligent life on Earth to evolve enough to perceive them, to be capable of integration. And now we have. Now we're ready. May 25th is when they complete emergence, when they stand fully present in our dimension, when they extend their consciousness toward every human on Earth and offer integration, offer to expand everyone's perception, offer to show us reality beyond 3-dimensional limitation. But it's always a choice. They won't force it, won't compel anyone who genuinely resists, but they will make the offer undeniable, will make their presence so overwhelming that everyone knows they're there. Everyone understands that expanded consciousness is possible. Everyone faces the decision." She told me about the choice, told me that integration wasn't binary, wasn't all or nothing. There were degrees, levels. People could accept partial integration, could expand their perception incrementally, could choose how far they wanted to evolve beyond baseline human consciousness. Some people would choose minimal integrations, just enough to perceive the entities, just enough to understand they exist, but remaining mostly anchored to 3-dimensional experience. Others would choose deeper integration, would want to perceive more dimensions, would want to exist across more frameworks, would want to become more like the entities themselves. And some, like Sarah, like David, like the most progressed volunteers, would choose complete integration, would dissolve the boundaries between human and entity consciousness almost entirely, would become beings that existed primarily in the multidimensional frameworks while maintaining just enough connection to physical form to remain technically alive by biological definitions. And there's no wrong choice, Sarah emphasized. The entities don't judge, don't prefer one decision over another. They're offering teaching, showing us what's possible. But they respect autonomy, respect that some humans will want to remain limited, will prefer the safety of 3-dimensional perception to the uncertainty of expansion. Those people will be allowed to remain unchanged, will be able to live their lives without integration. The entities will simply exist alongside them, present but not interfering. There for anyone who changes their mind, decides later that they want to see more, want to experience more, want to become more. Dr. Volkov showed me the projections, the Council's models for how humanity would respond to full emergence. They estimated that 47% would choose some level of integration within the first year. Another 30% would integrate eventually over 5 to 10 years as they observed integrated humans and became convinced the process was safe. 23% would never integrate, would remain purely human, would live in a world shared with beings who had evolved beyond them but who posed no threat, who simply existed in expanded frameworks while the non-integrated continued experiencing reality through their original limited perception. It will be the largest transformation in human history, Dr. Volkov said. Larger than the agricultural revolution, larger than industrialization, larger than the information age. This is consciousness evolution. This is humanity becoming something more, not replacing what we were, not destroying our humanity, but expanding it, adding dimensions, becoming capable of perceiving reality the way it actually exists, instead of through the filters evolution gave us, and it's voluntary. That's crucial. The entities could force it, could integrate everyone simultaneously whether we wanted it or not, but they're choosing to offer, to teach, to let us decide our own evolution. I had 52 days until May 25th. 52 days to decide whether I wanted to begin integration now, to undergo the process gradually with support and guidance, or whether I wanted to wait until emergence and make the choice in the moment when 17 entities 11 kilometers tall stood on Antarctica and extended their consciousness toward the entire human species. Sarah recommended early integration, said the gradual process was less traumatic, said having 12 weeks to adjust to expanded perception was preferable to making the choice during the overwhelming moment of full emergence, said that people who integrated early would be better positioned to help others, to serve as bridges, to explain what integration felt like to people who were terrified or confused or uncertain. I visited the observation chamber, stood at the viewport facing south, tried to see what David and Sarah and the other volunteers were perceiving, saw only ice, only horizon, only the normal three-dimensional landscape. But I felt something, pressure, presence, awareness that something vast existed beyond what my senses could detect, something patient, something that had been waiting 50 million years and was willing to wait longer. Something that wasn't hostile or threatening, but that was undeniably there, watching, observing, ready to teach whenever I indicated readiness to learn. I made my decision on March 18th, 54 days before full emergence. I chose integration, chose to undergo the gradual process, chose to follow Sarah's path, chose to become something more than purely human while retaining my humanity. Dr. Volkov assigned me a chamber, positioned me for optimal exposure to the entity 17 kilometers south, explained that I should spend 4 hours daily in observation, should meditate, should open my consciousness to expanded perception, should allow the entity's presence to gradually modify my neural architecture, should trust the process even when it became frightening or overwhelming or incomprehensible. The first session was subtle. I sat, watched the horizon, felt nothing unusual for 47 minutes. Then something shifted, a flicker, a moment where the eye seemed translucent, where I could sense something beneath it, something rising, something vast. The moment lasted 3 seconds. Then normal perception returned, but those 3 seconds changed everything, because I'd felt it, had perceived something beyond normal three-dimensional space, had experienced a dimension my neurology wasn't designed to process, and I wanted more, wanted to understand, wanted to see what Sarah was seeing, wanted to perceive the entity the way David perceived it, wanted to expand beyond the limitation of purely human consciousness. Integration progressed over subsequent weeks. Each session brought longer moments of expanded perception. Each day I could sense more dimensions, could feel consciousness existing across frameworks, could perceive the entity more completely. By week 4, I was experiencing sustained periods of multidimensional awareness. By week 7, I could maintain expanded perception for hours. By week 9, I understood what Sarah had meant. I was more Marcus than I'd ever been, more myself, because I was finally perceiving reality without filters, finally experiencing existence the way it actually was beyond evolutionary limitation. And I was ready for May 25th, ready for full emergence, ready to help others who would face the choice, ready to serve as bridge between purely human and integrated consciousness, ready to witness 17 entities 11 kilometers tall standing on Antarctica, ready to experience the moment when they extended their consciousness toward 8 billion humans and offered us transformation, ready to help explain what integration meant, ready to translate between frameworks, ready to teach the way the entities had taught me. This is Dr. Marcus Webb, former glaciologist, current integrated consciousness existing across multiple dimensional frameworks while maintaining connection to purely human identity. Recording this 53 days after beginning integration and 1 day before full emergence. Tomorrow, May 25, 2025, at 14:22 UTC, exactly 98 days after Station Vostok Alpha went dark, all 17 entities will complete emergence, will stand visible to satellites, will extend their consciousness toward every human on Earth, will offer integration to our entire species simultaneously. Some will accept immediately, some will resist, some will require time to understand what's being offered, but everyone will know. Everyone will feel their presence. Everyone will understand that we're not alone, that we've never been alone, that something vast and ancient and patient has been waiting beneath Antarctica for 50 million years for us to evolve enough to perceive it, for us to develop consciousness sophisticated enough to survive integration, for us to become ready for the teaching. And the teaching is this: reality is larger than 3 dimensions. Consciousness can exist across frameworks. Time is accessible from multiple perspectives. What we call human is just one configuration of awareness among infinite possibilities, and we can choose expansion, can choose to see more, can choose to become more, can choose evolution. I'm choosing it. Sarah chose it. 43 volunteers chose it. And tomorrow, when the entities complete emergence, millions more will choose it. Will choose to see what exists beyond the veil. Will choose to perceive reality as it actually is. Will choose to become something vast while remaining themselves. The entities are rising. I can feel them, all 17, approaching the surface, approaching the moment when they stand complete and visible and undeniable, approaching the moment when humanity discovers what's been sleeping beneath the ice, what's been waiting beneath our feet, what's been patient beyond comprehension. Tomorrow, everything changes. Tomorrow, we evolve. Tomorrow, we learn what the entities have been waiting 50 million years to teach us. And I'm ready. We're all ready. Even those who think they're not ready will be ready when they feel the presence, when they understand what's being offered, when they face the choice between remaining limited or becoming vast. May 25, 2025. Full emergence, the teaching begins. Humanity awakens to reality beyond three-dimensional limitation, and nothing will ever be the same. Recording ends May 24, 2025, 23:47 UTC. Emergence timeline: 14 hours 35 minutes, 17 entities approaching surface. Integration protocols. Active humanity will choose. The teaching awaits. They have been patient, they will continue to be patient. Evolution is voluntary, expansion is offered, reality is vast, we are ready.